Don't you dare sit in that seat. Coach is all the way in the back. The words cut sharply through the first-class cabin before the boarding doors could even fully close. The wheels of a rolling carry-on clicked to a sudden halt. A man lowered his magazine, eyes darting up. Near the front of the plane, a woman in an ivory wool blazer stood over seat 2B. One hand gripped the overhead bin, while the other pressed flat against the headrest, as if she were planting a flag on stolen land. Marcus Webb froze in the middle of the aisle, holding his plain black duffel bag. At 47, wearing a faded Henley, dark trousers, and scuffed leather loafers, he carried no luxury watch and had no entourage trailing behind him. His face was a mask of pure calm, a quiet resilience forged from years of walking into rooms where people sized up his blue-collar roots long before they ever looked at his resume. Seat 2B belonged to him. He'd booked this flight from Boston to Houston weeks ago after a brutal stretch of work that had left him completely drained. To Marcus, a first-class seat wasn't about status or showing off. It was a rare pocket of peace on a 9-mile-high sanctuary, bought and paid for with his own sweat. But Diane Hargrove, 54, with a razor-sharp winter wheat bob and stiletto heels that had no business being on a 7 a.m. flight, clearly saw it differently. Her eyes swept over him like a price scanner, the faded shirt, the worn-out shoes, the calloused hands. Then came that plastic, tight-lipped smile. She jerked her chin up, raising her voice just enough to command the entire cabin. "I'm talking to you. Are you deaf? Move aside so the people who actually paid for first class can sit down." "I don't know what your ticket says," she announced, loud enough for the first 4 rows to hear. "But I've been flying this route for 11 years, and this has always been my seat." Marcus looked at the row, then at the pass in his hand, then at her. "The pass says 2B, he said. "Then there's been a mistake," she said. "Not a question. A verdict. Pay attention to what Marcus Webb did not do. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift his weight from foot to foot. He did not look around for someone to save him. He simply held the boarding pass in one hand and waited, the way a man waits who has done this before, who has stood in many rooms where people decided first and listened second, and who has learned that the truth does not need a raised voice to be true. A flight attendant materialized from the galley. Her name tag read Sandra Oakes, and she had the practiced smile of someone who spent most of her days managing the distance between what passengers wanted and what the rules allowed. "Can I help sort this out?" she asked. Diane spoke first. She always spoke first. "This man is trying to take my seat. I fly Premier with this airline. I always sit in 2B. Someone needs to fix this." Sandra turned to Marcus with the kind of careful expression that told him everything before she opened her mouth. "Sir," she said, "if you'd be willing to take 3A, it's still in first class, same service." "No," Marcus said. Sandra blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The seat on my pass is 2B, Marcus said. "I'd like to sit in it." What happened in the next 4 seconds felt longer than it was. Sandra's smile went rigid at the corners. Diane's chin lifted. Somewhere in row 4, a younger man in a business suit quietly lifted his phone, not pointed at anyone yet, just ready. Diane turned to the cabin like she was addressing a jury. "This is what happens," she said, "when they oversell these cabins. I will be speaking with corporate about this. I want his name, I want her name, and I want it noted that I have been a Premier Diamond member for 9 consecutive years." Sandra looked at Marcus again. He hadn't moved. "Sir, I understand your frustration. You haven't checked the manifest yet," Marcus said. Another pause. "I'm sorry? The manifest, check it." Sandra looked down at her tablet. Her thumb moved, stopped, moved again. The color in her face changed in a way that was small and unmistakable to anyone watching closely. The man in row 4 noticed it. The retired-looking woman in 3C noticed it. Even Diane, who was not watching Sandra, felt the change and looked over. Sandra set the tablet down slightly too fast. Mrs. Hargrove, she said carefully, your assigned seat is 3A. Dead quiet. Not the quiet of an empty room. The quiet of a room full of people who have all decided at the same moment to stop breathing. Diane stared at her. That cannot be right. Your boarding pass. I did not fly here from LaGuardia at 6:15 in the morning to sit in 3A. Diane's voice had picked up an edge that cut through the recycled air. I am a Premier Diamond member. I have seat preferences on file. I have flown this route for 11 years. This, she gestured at Marcus without quite looking at him, is a clerical error, and I expect it to be corrected. Marcus put his duffel in the overhead compartment. He did it slowly, deliberately, without drama. The overhead door clicked shut. Then he sat down in seat 2B. Diane made a sound like something tearing. Excuse me, I did not say you could sit there. You don't need to, Marcus said. The airline said so 19 days ago. And here is the moment. The frozen moment. Where everything stops, and every person in that first-class cabin makes a silent choice about who they are. Sandra looked at Diane. Diane looked at Marcus. Marcus looked straight ahead at the oval window, where the morning was gray and flat over the tarmac. The man in row 4 had his phone up now, filming. The woman in 3C pressed her lips together. A man across the aisle in 2A, salt and pepper beard, well-worn blazer, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, set his book down on his lap and watched without pretending not to. Sandra inhaled, turned back to Diane. Mrs. Hargrove, I'll need you to take your assigned seat so we can complete boarding. What Diane did next would be the thing people talked about later. She turned to face Sandra fully, and she pointed at Marcus without extending her arm all the way, a short, sharp point, like she was indicating a spill that needed cleaning. I want it on record, she said, clear and deliberate, that I am extremely uncomfortable sitting behind a man who walked in here acting like he owns the place. The man in 3A, the one with the salt and pepper beard, looked up from his book. He does own his seat, the man said. Diane turned to him. Nobody asked you. You said it loud enough that everyone in this cabin heard it, the man replied. I'm just responding. Diane's eyes went cold. She turned back to Sandra. I want to speak to your supervisor. I'll get our lead attendant, Sandra said, and she moved toward the galley with a walk that was slightly too fast to be casual. Marcus sat in 2B with his hands resting on his thighs, the boarding pass still folded in his left hand. He had not unfolded it again. He did not need to. He thought of his grandmother, Cecile Webb, who had worked the check-in counter at a Houston bus station for 31 years, who had worn the same pair of black flats every single day because she said shoes were not worth spending on when your grandchildren needed school supplies. She used to tell him, the truth doesn't need to argue. It just needs to stay in the room. He stayed in the room. The lead flight attendant's name was Glenn Archer, and he came out of the galley with the kind of posture that said he had been briefed already and had decided before he arrived what shape this situation needed to take. He was 49, broad in the shoulders, a practiced authority in the set of his jaw. He looked at Diane first. That was a choice, whether he knew it or not. Mrs. Hargrove, he said. I understand there's been some confusion. I want to assure you we take Premier Diamond status very seriously. Diane's shoulders dropped half an inch. There has been no confusion, Marcus said. Glenn looked at him with a polished patience that was not patience at all. Sir, I'm just trying to resolve this so we can depart on time. Then ask her to take her seat. Mr. Webb. Glenn's mouth closed. Something moved across his face. Quick, involuntary. He looked at the tablet Sandra had handed him. His eyes moved down the passenger list and stopped. Marcus noticed the stop. Mr. Webb, Glenn said, and his voice had changed register by about 3 degrees. I wonder if we could speak privately for just a moment. No, Marcus said. Glenn's eyes moved again, back to the list. Back to Marcus. Is there something on your account I should be aware of? There's something on this boarding pass you should be aware of, Marcus said. It says 2B. I'm in 2B. That is all that needs to be resolved. Diane, who had been standing in the aisle, with her handbag pressed against her ribs, looked between the two of them. Something about the shift in Glenn's voice had unsettled her, and she did not like being unsettled. I don't know what's happening here, she said, her own voice tighter now, but I want to make something clear. I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking for the standard that every Premier Diamond member is entitled to. This man, the short, sharp point again, has made a scene out of what should have been a simple accommodation request, and I think that speaks for itself. The retired woman in 3C made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Ma'am, she said, and she was talking to Diane. You were in the wrong seat. Diane turned to her. I beg your pardon? You were in the wrong seat, the woman repeated. She was 71, white-haired, hands folded over a paperback novel. And she said it the way a person says something they have been deciding whether to say for the past 5 minutes and have finally decided. That young man, she nodded at Marcus, was polite. You have not been. Diane stared at her. You don't know anything about this situation. I know what I saw, the woman said, and she opened her paperback. What happened next would have nothing. Just one more moment of first-class inconvenience dissolved into departure, except that Diane Hargrove, 9-year Premier Diamond member, did not know how to lose a small thing. And that was the thing that destroyed her. She turned to Marcus, and she leaned in, and she said it quietly enough that the people in rows 4 and 5 couldn't hear. But the people in rows 2 and 3 could, and so could the man with the salt and pepper beard directly across the aisle, and so could Sandra, who had come back from the galley to stand behind Glenn. People like you, Diane said, always want to make everything a confrontation. Just take the other seat. It's not that complicated. The cabin didn't gasp. Cabins rarely do. What they did was go very still. Glenn closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Sandra pressed 2 fingers over her mouth. The man in row 4 kept filming. Marcus turned his head and looked at Diane Hargrove for the first time without looking away. His voice, when it came, was the quietest it had been. Say that again, he said. Diane's chin went up. I said some people always want to make everything. I heard you, Marcus said. I wanted you to hear yourself. The stillness got heavier. Diane blinked. Behind her, the salt and pepper beard man set his book down on the armrest and said, to no one in particular. She just said, people like you. Diane turned to him, color rising in her face. That is not what I meant. Then what did you mean? The man asked. No answer. Glenn Archer took a breath and said, Mrs. Hargrove, I'm going to need you to take 3A immediately, or I will have to ask ground crew to assist. You cannot be serious. Diane's voice had jumped up half an octave. I am telling you this man has been rude and hostile since he walked into this cabin. He hasn't raised his voice once, Sandra said. Diane turned to her. Something in Diane's face cracked, just at the edges. Whose side are you on? Sandra looked at her for a long moment. I'm on the side of whoever has the right seat, she said. There are moments in a room where authority finally arrives. Not loud authority, quiet authority. The kind that comes when someone who has been watching stops pretending they are not watching and simply speaks the truth out loud. Sandra Oakes was 36 years old, had worked this route for 7 years, had made a wrong call 3 minutes ago and knew it, and was now making the right one. And that was the moment Marcus Webb's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. 3 messages, stacked. The sender on the last one made Glenn Archer's eyes go wide when Marcus tilted the phone at an angle Glenn could just barely read. Corporate affairs, priority. Glenn looked at Marcus, he said. Voice dropped. Is there something I should know before I contact the captain? Contact the captain if you need to, Marcus said. That's your call. Glenn looked at the tablet again. His thumb moved through the account profile. And then it stopped. and his face did something that Sandra noticed, and that the salt and pepper beard man noticed, and that the woman in 3C noticed, and whatever it was made all three of them sit up slightly. Glenn stepped back 2 paces, which was all the aisle allowed, and he called the cockpit. The captain of Flight 884 was a woman named Patricia Hollis, 56 years old, short gray hair, 31 years in the air. She came out of the cockpit with the kind of efficiency that does not waste steps. She looked at Glenn. Glenn handed her the tablet. Captain Hollis read the screen. Then she looked at Marcus, not at his shoes, not at his bag, at his face. "Mr. Webb," she said. "Captain," he said, "I apologize for the delay." Diane stepped forward from 3A, where she had still not fully sat down. "I'd like to know what is on that tablet," she said. Captain Hollis turned to her slowly. "Mrs. Hargrove, you're going to need to sit down. I have a right to know." "You have a seat assignment," Captain Hollis said. "Seat 3A. Please take it." "This is outrageous." Diane's voice had gone thin and brittle, the voice of someone who has been building a wall their whole life and has just run out of bricks. "I have filed a complaint every year for 9 years, when my service fell below standard. Do you know how many miles I have with this airline? Do you know who I know at your regional office?" Captain Hollis looked at her without any visible reaction. "Sit down," she said. "Please." Something in the please made it worse than a command. Diane Hargrove sat down. The cabin breathed. Marcus Webb looked at the oval window. Outside, a ground crew member in an orange vest was walking the tarmac with a clipboard, squinting into the morning light, completely unaware that 40 feet above him something had just shifted in a way that would not be easy to shift back. Captain Hollis turned to Marcus. "Mr. Webb, I'm going to ask you directly. Are you the same Marcus Webb who is the managing partner of Hollis Capital Aviation Partners?" The cabin went electric. Glenn's face went blank. Sandra's hand stopped moving. The man in row 4 lowered his phone, then raised it again. Diane Hargrove's mouth opened. Marcus said, "Yes, Hollis Capital Aviation Partners, the firm that held equity stakes in 4 regional carriers. The firm whose infrastructure division had built the passenger experience software now running on every screen in this airline's fleet. The firm whose contract renewal, worth $34, $7 million over 3 years, was scheduled for signature in 11 days. Glenn turned to Sandra. Sandra looked at the floor. "Mr. Webb," Captain Hollis said, "may I ask what brought you to Houston today?" "Quarterly review," Marcus said. "I was going to read the briefing documents on the flight." He glanced toward 3A, where Diane Hargrove sat with her handbag in her lap and her face the color of old ash. "I didn't expect to spend the boarding process teaching a room full of adults what a boarding pass is for." Nobody laughed. This was not a laughing moment. Marcus reached into his duffel and pulled out a slim leather card holder. He held it out to Captain Hollis. She took it, read it, handed it back without a word. Then Marcus looked at Glenn. "How many times," he said, "has someone in one of these seats been asked to move because someone louder wanted to sit there?" Glenn said nothing. "How many times," Marcus continued, "did that person move because it was easier, because they didn't want to make a scene, because they'd learned to make themselves smaller to keep the room comfortable?" Silence. "I want that question answered," Marcus said. "Not by you, by your data, by whoever built the complaint analytics on this system." He paused. "Which, as it happens, was my team." The recording from seat 4D would later show the moment. Glenn Archer closed his eyes, and Diane Hargrove's hand went to her mouth. It would show the retired woman in 3C nodding once, slow and deliberate, like something she had suspected for years had just been confirmed. It would show the salt and pepper beard man looking down at the armrest, and then looking up at Marcus Webb with an expression that was something close to relief. Sandra Oak spoke then. She did not ask permission. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I knew the manifest was clear. I knew whose seat it was. I asked you to move Because I thought it would be easier, she stopped. I was wrong. And I'm sorry. The apology had weight. It cost her something visible, and so it meant something. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. Then he looked at Diane Hargrove. She was sitting in 3A with the rigidity of someone who has decided that composure is the last thing they have left. Her pearls were slightly crooked. Her blazer, still perfect, seemed somehow inadequate now, like expensive armor that had turned out to be decorative. I didn't know who you were, she said. Her voice was almost inaudible. I know, Marcus said. I wasn't trying to. Mrs. Hargrove. His voice was not unkind. It was something quieter and more serious than unkind. You said people like you. I'd like you to sit with what that means. Not what you meant by it. What it means. Diane looked at the tray table in front of her. Her hands were in her lap, and her fingers were pressing into each other, knuckle to knuckle. The man in row 4 kept filming. Captain Hollis returned to the cockpit. Before she disappeared through the door, she stopped and said, without turning around, Glenn, full incident report, before we land. Yes, Captain, Glenn said. Flight 884 departed Boston Logan at 7:51 a.m., which was 44 minutes late. The flight was quiet. First class had the silence of people who were thinking rather than the silence of people who were sleeping. Diane Hargrove requested no drinks, no meal. She sat with a magazine open in her lap, but her eyes never moved down the page. The salt and pepper beard man read his book until somewhere over Pennsylvania, when he looked across the aisle at Marcus and said quietly, I should have said something sooner. Marcus looked at him. You said it, Marcus said. Not soon enough. Nobody ever does, Marcus said. But some people eventually do. The man nodded and went back to his book. Marcus took out his briefing documents somewhere over West Virginia. The quarterly numbers were good. The contract renewal was solid. His team had done careful work. He read without distraction, and the clouds outside were flat and white, and the engines held the same note they always held, and seat 2B was exactly as quiet as he had needed it to be. What happened after landing is not a single moment. It is a sequence. The incident report Glenn Archer filed detailed every exchange in the forward cabin, including the recorded footage voluntarily submitted by the passenger in 4D. 6 other passengers submitted written statements through the airline's secure portal, accessed via the same app Marcus's company had helped design. The statements were consistent, specific. Time-stamped, the airline's corporate affairs office opened a formal passenger service review within 4 hours of landing. Glenn Archer was placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the review. Sandra Oaks was not. Her voluntary statement and on-record acknowledgement of her initial error were cited as mitigating factors. Diane Hargrove received a letter from the airline's legal department 7 days later. Her Premier Diamond status was suspended while the review was ongoing. 3 other passengers had filed complaints about interactions with her on previous flights, complaints that had been marked resolved and filed away. They were reopened. Marcus Webb did not request these outcomes. He did not call anyone from the plane. He did not threaten. He ate the meal in first class, read his documents, and slept for 40 minutes somewhere over Louisiana, with his hand resting on the armrest of seat 2B. His chief legal officer called him as he was walking through Houston Hobby. The board saw the footage, she said. I know, he said. They're moving the contract signature up. They want to add a service equity clause. Good, he said. How are you? He thought of his grandmother, Cecile, who had worked 31 years at a bus station check-in counter and come home every night with the same flat shoes and the same quiet face, and had never once told him the world was fair. She had only told him, stay in the room. I'm fine, he said. He meant it. The contract expansion was signed 11 days later, as scheduled, at a conference table in downtown Houston. The new clause required the airline to implement bias tracking on passenger complaint records, software that could identify patterns: who got moved, who got labeled difficult, who got downgraded without documentation. The airline's vice president of customer experience shook Marcus's hand across the table and said, "We should have been doing this years ago." Marcus said, "Yes." He said nothing else about it. There was nothing else that needed saying. 3 months later, Sandra Oakes was promoted to senior cabin services trainer. In her first session with a new cohort of flight attendants, she told them about a boarding pass and a woman in a navy Henley and a man in a wool blazer, and what happens when you choose the easy call over the right one. She told them without names. She didn't need names. The woman in 3C, her name was Ruth Calloway, 71, retired middle school principal, and she spent 34 years telling students that what they did when no one was grading them was the truest measure of who they were. Sent a note to the airline 2 weeks after the flight. It was handwritten on cream-colored paper. It said, "I have been flying for 40 years. This was the first time I said something. I am glad I did. I am sorry it took this long." The airline framed it, not publicly, not in a press release, just in a small frame on the wall of the training room, next to the window that looked out over the tarmac. And the leather card holder, Marcus Webb, managing partner, Hollis Capital Aviation Partners, sat on the corner of his desk in the Houston office the way it always. Oh, what? Slightly worn at one corner, nothing special to look at. His grandmother had given him the card holder. She had saved for it for months and presented it to him the day he made partner with both hands and said, "Now you carry something that says your name." He had carried it since. He would carry it still. If this story stayed with you, not because of what happened at the end, but because of something you recognized somewhere in the middle, please like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity doesn't have to announce itself. And leave a comment with the one question I'm asking everyone today. Have you ever been in that cabin? Which side were you on? I read every single reply.